In this presentation, we will take a look at another form within the vendor section, that form being a check within QuickBooks Online. Here we are in the free test drive file for Craig's design and landscaping you could find by searching for QuickBooks Online test drive. We're now going to go to the flowchart in QuickBooks Desktop to just take a look at that flowchart. You'll remember up top we have our flowchart, basic flowchart for the vendor section, the people we owe, entering the bill, then paying the bill. Now, obviously, we can also simply just write a check, right? We can just write a check rather than going through the process of entering the bill, going through accounts payable, then paying the bill. As we mentioned, when we entered the bills, there are some benefits to entering the bill. One is to be able to organize the bill and then print all the checks at one time, those that you choose to print. However, it is possible to go right to the writing checks. Now, note that when you see the writing checks in the home page of the desktop version, it's not in the vendor section, it's in the banking section, because again, you could write checks for things other than the vendor. It's possible to write yourself a check, for example. It's possible to write checks to things like paying off a loan, where you wouldn't think of the bank as in that case, if they loaned you money and you're paying it back, as necessarily a vendor. A vendor is typically going to be people that we are purchasing from. However, the majority of checks we write are probably going to be written to some type of vendor, and therefore the checks you would think would be appropriately up top for the most part in the vendor section, or at least a part of the vendor cycle. So then if we go back to the QuickBooks Online and we go into the new tab on the left and we select the new tab, notice in this form of QuickBooks, they did put it under the vendor section. So if we go down here, we see the check, as opposed to when we saw the other items under the bank, they put the bank deposit over here instead of into the customer section, which is kind of indicated in QuickBooks Desktop as part of the flow of the customer cycle. Here in the desktop version, they got the check in the bank account, and over here they put it right under the vendor section. So note that there is some overlap with these items, but you want to know the forms that will be driving within the major cycles, and typically a check you could probably be thinking of within the vendor cycle, because once again you'd be paying typically vendors with the check. So if we think about the check, what's going to be the transaction related to the check? It's a bit more straightforward, of course, because when we see a check, we know one thing: the cash is going down, the checking account is going down. And then the other side would typically be going to whatever bill we are paying. So for example, if I was to choose a payee here, we're going to choose another payee. We're going to choose here Chin's Gas and Oil. And so we're going to choose that item. We're going to write a check. The check will be here. We're going to write it for the date of 01, let's say 29 at the end of the month, 20. So there we have that. And then we're going to put the category. Note once again, it populated the category for us because the last time we wrote a check to gas and oil, it went to maintenance and repairs. So it should be going to maintenance repairs. We got the amount of 185, which would be populated from the prior check that we wrote. It might be a little different this time. Let's say it's 190, and that would be the check that we would have. What would be happening, of course, we would be decreasing the checking account, would be going down. Other side going to the expense account, in this case, of the maintenance and repairs. So I'm going to say save and new. Now, I just want to point out the categories here. Like this, the check, you'll note, is very similar to the bills that we had set up. If it said bill up top, we would be affecting the accounts payable. Check meaning, of course, we're going to be affecting the checking account. Now, down here, it's important to note that we have the two sections. We got the categories, and then we have the items section. Now, when we think about the categories, it could be a little bit confusing, because you would think the category is usually an expense. And just to jump over to the desktop version, just for an example, if you go to the desktop version and we were to write a check, if we actually write a check, you'll see the tabs in kind of a different format, so we can kind of compare and contrast. This is similar to bills, will have a similar construction. In the desktop version, instead of the online version, you've got the expenses tabs and then the items tabs. Expenses and items tabs. And if you go back to QuickBooks Online, what we have instead are the category details, and then we have the item details. That's like the expenses tab and the items tab. Now, in desktop, it's a little bit confusing to call this expenses. It's probably better that they renamed it. It's more descriptive because most of the time it is expenses, not expensive, but expenses. Expenses can be expensive, but Anyways, if you go back over here, it's probably better to call it a category details, because most of the time these are going to be expensive, but not always, because you can think of something else we purchase, such as if you purchase property, plant, and equipment. So if I was to pay a check for an asset account of property, plant, and equipment, I can say, all right, it's going to be going to, like, for example, if I bought a truck, then it would be going to, this account would still be hit, it would still be debited, but the debit that would be increasing an asset rather than increasing an expense. It would be on the balance sheet rather than an expense. So just realize that here you could have an asset account that you're going to be hit instead. And also note, just like with the bills, that if you have the items that you're purchasing, inventory items, these would be inventory items. So you'd have to select an inventory item down here. You could write a check for the inventory item. And what would be happening there, it needs to be down in the items, because you're not affecting simply an account. You will be affecting the account of inventory. And you might say, well, why can't I put inventory up here? Well, you could, but then it won't be tracking the detail. Well, what we want to have is another report that tracks the type of inventory so that we can track the detail of that inventory account. So that's a couple just things to know about the checks. I'm going to not record these. I'm going to close this out. Let's take a look at our financial statements where we wrote that one check. So I'm going to close this one out. And do you want to leave? I'm going to say yes. I would like to leave without saving it. We're going to open up our trusty reports once again, going down to the reports down below, opening up our favorite two reports. The first one being the profit and loss report. Profit and loss report now being open. We're going to change the dates up top. The dates are going to be for 01/01/20 to 12/31/20, January through December 2020. We're going to run that report. Then I'm going to duplicate the tab, right click on the tab up top, duplicate it. So we're going to have another tab. I'm going to go back to the first tab. I'm going to have faith that that shows up. It takes a little bit of time, and it should be. And then I'm going to go down to the reports again. We're going to say that we now want the balance sheet report. Let's go into the balance sheet report. Going to change the dates up top. Dates up top being from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. Going to run that report. Then once again, I'll duplicate that report. We're going to right click on the tab up top. We're going to duplicate that report. Okay, so now we're in the balance sheet. I'm holding down control and I'm scrolling up a little bit so it scrolls in a little bit. Give us a little zoom in action there. Now we're going to be in the assets. We want to then check the checking account. The checking account is going to go down by the check that we wrote. We're going to then go into the checking account detail. There it is on 129. There's the check we wrote, and it's going down by the 190. If I want to see the detail, we can drill down in the checking account on the detail for it, and there's the actual check. So that works like we would think. I'm going to close this one back out. The other side, of course, going to the expense account. I'm going to go back to the left, going to scroll back up. I'm going to go back to our report summary. We're then going to go to the expense accounts, which are on the profit and loss or income statement. So I'm going to go to the tab to the right, which is our profit and loss statement. Let's scroll on down, see where we put that item. It went to the expense account of maintenance and repairs. Maintenance and repairs, the 190. Going into the 190, there's our check. So if we select that check, it'll go back into it. Notice this check doesn't say bill check, right? It's just this plain check, even though it's basically the same form. If I go back to our data, as we did when we wrote the check for the telephone. If I go into the telephone detail, you'll recall here we entered the bill first and then the check. So here's the bill. We don't see the actual payment happening down here because the bill and the payment didn't happen at the same time. If I go to the balance sheet and we take a look at the checking account, let's go back into the checking account. And we see what's going out of the checking account. These three are all checks, right? These three are all checks. However, this one's being indicated by the form of a check. And that's going to indicate that I'm going to have to look at the detail to see what the other side is, which is probably an expense account. These two are indicating that, yeah, they're a check, but they went through the bill pay format. And therefore, although this is generating a check, which is the same actual kind of form documentation that we're actually going to send out in the mail, a check, it's in the system as a bill pay, which is telling us right there that it's going to be affecting accounts payable rather than going directly to, say, an expense account. And if we want to know the expense account that's been ultimately affected in when we enter the bill, then we're going to have to go back to the actual bill rather than the check, which we can do by going through the detail here, drilling down further to the actual bill.